Let me ask you something. Do you know what that tree is behind me? Well, I'll give you a hint. We're in the evergreen state, right here in Yakima, Washington. So good chance it's an evergreen. If you got any further than that and said it was a Douglas fir, I'd be pretty impressed. Most people aren't really good at identifying plants. To most people, they're just kind of the background. They're just there. Well, we need to learn how to speak botany in a way, to learn the language of plants and to learn to recognize them, just like we do people. You know, we're really hardwired in an amazing degree to recognize people. You know, we could recognize if that was one of your friends standing back that far, you'd probably know it was them, even without a really sharp image. Case in point, take a look at this. Who's this? Well, of course you know it's George Washington. Apparently I wasn't the only one to wonder, would we recognize him in modern dress and with a modern haircut? I'm not entirely sure, but the fact of the matter is, humans are really, really good at facial recognition. We're just hardwired for it. Well, how about plants? Who's this? Well, let's take a little bit closer look. And that bark is pretty distinctive. Maybe you need a little more detail. Yeah, see the leaves? That might clue you in as quaking aspen. Did you get that? Well, for plants, we need to just learn what the lingo is. We need to learn what features to look for. We don't have ears and eyes and noses, but they have leaves and petals and stems. And so we need to learn to look for those subtle differences to be able to start identifying plants for whatever reasons you might have, whether it's pulling out weeds instead of your garden plants, or just identifying plants so you know what they are while you're out for a hike in the woods. So the study of what plants look like, those subtle features, is known as plant morphology. So the term morpho refers to the form. If we study plant anatomy, usually we're looking at the microscopic views. So this is stuff you can do with your own eyes, or maybe magnifying glass. And this has a fair bit to do with the terminology, but also just noticing things from the obvious, is it a tree or does it look more like a fern, to the really subtle, do the hairs on the stem point upward or downward? And plants can be pretty tricky. Case in point, look at these two. Are these the same species? They sure look a lot alike, they even smell a lot alike, but they're different. And those differences are pretty small and subtle. Whatever your reason for identifying plants, I find that a good field guide is indispensable. Internet is useful, and I'll talk about that in different episodes about how to use that well, but field guides, especially if they're specific to your area, are really very useful. This one goes through a whole variety of plants and even lichens and fungi. So that's a pretty nice broad one that covers a pretty big area. These by a timber press get a little bit narrower. This one covers just the wildflowers. It's organized by the flower color, but that's just the small plants, and you have to have a flower to really get it well. Trees and shrubs are a nice place to start, so this one narrows the world a little bit, and they're usually always out there for you, which is kind of a nice feature of trees and shrubs. Now, if you really want to get technical, you pick up a more academic resource like Flora of the Pacific Northwest, and this goes through all the vascular plants. It's very technical, and it's just drawings, no photos, a lot of technical language. In any resource that you use, you're going to have to know some terminology. My goal in this video is not to teach you all of the terms, but to coach you on what to look for, and maybe you'll pick up a few terms along the way. Either way, a lot of this is practice, and you'll spend a lot of time going back and looking up terms in the glossary. So that's just part of the hard work that goes into it. Not all of the ideas I discuss apply to all plants. Most of what we're going to talk about applies to the flowering plants and the gymnosperms. Most of the gymnosperms are the conifers, but these are the common plants you're going to see. We won't really talk much about non-vascular plants. These are things like liverworts, those flat ones on the ground in moist areas, and mosses with those spore-producing capsules. Ferns and similar fern-like plants like the horsetails and lycopods have some applicability, and some of the terms we talk about will apply to them, but not all. Let's get into the details. Now I have 4 sets of drawings that I want to show you, and after each one, I'm going to show you some pictures so that you can practice. So I encourage you along the way to pause the video anytime you want. If you want to study them, I'm not always going to talk about every single term. And so if you want to study those, you'll need to pause the video. All right, let's start with the growth form, or sometimes the more technical term, the growth habit of the plant. The real dividing line here is whether the plant is woody or not woody. So if they're not woody, they're herbs, or sometimes known as forbs. Now the woody plants, there's no real clear dividing line between tree and shrub. Sometimes there's a real gray area. Usually trees just have one trunk, often very tall. Shrubs usually have more than one stem coming from the ground, but both are woody. Shrubs are usually shorter. If they're really short, we might call them a subshrub. Let's move over to the forbs, and if it's not a grass or fern-like plant, then we'd often call it a forb. Most of these fall into the group of dicots, if that's something familiar to you. Very often it's important to know if it's annual, those that live one season, or biennial, those that live 2 seasons, just flowering the second season and then dying. If it's a perennial, there's often some subtle clues that you'll need to understand to tell if it's perennial or not. One, usually it's just a stouter plant, much larger, no wood, but sometimes a woody rootstock or a fleshy one underground. You shouldn't go digging these things up. There may be other clues above ground, like dead vegetation from the previous season beneath the living stuff of this season. So those are a few. The other ones, now there's specific families, like the grass family, and there's several fern families, and those refer to specific plants. But there are many plants that look like grasses, and so we'll just include them in this group of grass-like plants, and some that even look like ferns. There are a few other groups of organisms, like cacti and other succulents, but these would be the major ones. A few other features you might look for is whether the plant is evergreen or deciduous. Does it lose its leaves in the fall? Now, just because it's evergreen doesn't mean it's a conifer like this one here. There are many evergreen plants that keep their leaves all year. The height of the plant. You should note the general height, whether it's just a mental note or something you're writing down in a notebook. And then colors. What specific color green? Is there red on the stems or any other colors, especially flower color would be important if they're available, and any other unusual features of the plant. All right, let's practice a little bit. So on this one, I'd like you to take the terms and the ideas that we just learned and see if you can determine what the growth form of each of these plants is. So if you want, you can pause the video and make your guesses. All right, let's go over them now. So this first one is actually a pretty tough one. It's beargrass. It's a grass-like plant, but these flowers kind of give it away and indicate it's not really a grass. Grasses, like this one to the far right, have these unusual flowers. They're really subtle. They are flowers, but they don't look like much. They're definitely not showy. They don't have these big petals like the beargrass does over here. So those are a couple harder ones. This one in the middle should be pretty easy. Really tall plant, woody stems, that's clearly a shrub. And then this one here is a fern. How'd you do? I hope you did well. Let's move on to the next topic. Most of the rest of what I'll talk about has to do with leaves specifically and the details about those leaves. So let's take a look at the leaf anatomy, or really the morphology of these guys, starting with what is a leaf? Because there are several types of leaves. You might look at this and assume that this right here, even though it looks very much like a leaf, is a leaf. But really, in fact, those are leaflets. And we need to understand that there's a couple major groups. There are simple leaves, and there are compound leaves. And compound leaves are dissected up into leaflets. Every leaf, though, sort of what defines it, it has this blade, and I'll leave you to look at some of these terms on your own, but that blade of the leaf can be dissected or not. And what really defines a leaf is this bud right down here. This is a meristem, tissue that will keep growing, will become a longer stem. And sometimes, but not always, along with that at the base of the leaf is something called a stipule. This can be leafy. It can also be little spines, like sometimes you find on roses, for example. But many plants don't have them. Sometimes they fall off. So you won't always find those, but you always find this bud here at the base of the leaf. Sometimes it's really obvious, other times it's not. So you're carrying that same one forward. Here at the base of this compound leaf, we can tell that these out here are leaflets because none of them have a bud at the base. And the bud is down here. Now this one in particular is a pinnately compound leaf. Pinna refers to feather, and it looks kind of feather-like. That is opposed to a palmately compound leaf. Looks more like a hand, with a thumb and a bunch of fingers. And so it's just a different arrangement of leaflets, but still bud at the base. Now, not all leaves have this long leaf stalk or petiole. Sometimes leaves are sessile, where there's no petiole at all. And sometimes they even clasp the stem, like this one down here. They can even be super compound. This one is twice compound because it has that main midrib. Those then branch off, and then the leaflets are off of that second branch. And so that one is twice compound. They can be 3 times or more compound. And a lot of times, plants that are highly dissected like this look fairly fern-like. Well, let's practice a little bit. So pause the video and see if you can guess which of these is simple and which is compound. All right, let's take a look. So the one right in the middle is simple. Those are clearly simple leaves. They're also sessile. You might have picked up on that one. They don't have leaf stalks or petioles on them. A little more difficult one over here is this one that is simple but really dissected. It looks like it kind of has leaflets. It could be compound, but that one is still a simple leaf. This strawberry down here is compound. It has 3 leaflets, 1, 2, and 3. Here we have the Jacob's ladder, and that is clearly a pinnately compound leaf. The base is way down here at the ground level. And then finally, lupin is palmately compound. Pretty classic example of that there. Now, I did say they could be highly dissected. Here's one that's ternately, or 3 times compound. We have this main rachis running up here. That then branches again, and that branches again before you find any leaflets. So they can be highly dissected. It looks very ferny. You can see how it takes on that fern-like appearance in this lomatium, which is really a flowering plant, not a fern at all. Now that we know what a leaf is and how to define it, we can talk about their arrangement along the stem. I'm just showing, for the simplicity here, only simple leaves, but the same can be true of compound leaves. If the leaves alternate, this one in particular is right, then left, then right again, and there's only one leaf coming off at each of these nodes, sort of a branching point where you find that bud at the base, then we call that alternate. Obvious enough name. They alternate, usually back and forth, right and left. If there are 2 leaves per node, then those are an opposite arrangement. If there's more than 2, then that is whorled, a term that we'll come back to in a different video when we talk about flowers as well. We don't see many examples of this, at least not in the Pacific Northwest. You have to go more to the tropics to find examples of these. We will see quite a few examples of fascicles, and these can be really confusing because they kind of look alternate. This looks like a node right here, another one here, and there's like a bunch of leaves, so maybe that's a compound leaf. But these are really spur branches that are coming out of there, and so this short little branch is a spur. You'll see this on apple trees, cherry trees, and even pine trees. Of course, they're needles, and then each of these leaves is in a cluster off of the end of that stem. Oftentimes, if you could really discern it, it would be alternate arrangement, but in a group like that, fascicled is a helpful term to know. And then basal, many plants just come out of the ground or appear to. There's a really short stem down here at the base, and so we'll just describe that as a basal arrangement. Well, let's practice again. So pause the video and see if you can guess each of these. Okay, let's go over them. So this first one is opposite, and this is a nice example of an opposite leaf arrangement and also compound leaves. This is also opposite, but with simple leaves, and we can see sort of what happened here. We used to have a pair of leaves here, and then those buds grew out into further branches that were also opposite. So if you have opposite leaves, you will also have opposite branching. And so now the leaves are off of here. Could be easy to think of this as a compound leaf. If you look really closely, you would see a bud at the base of each of these leaves. Let's move on. We have fascicled leaves over here. This is that spur branch I was talking about. This is a pin cherry, and then you have several leaves off of that spur branch. And then basal, that one's easy enough, right in the middle here. And then kind of a rare example of whorled. This is bed straw, genus Gallium, where you have quite a few leaves coming off of one point on the stem. How'd you do? It takes some practice. See if you can guess each of these. All right, here we go. This first one is alternate. We can see that main stem running here, and we can see a leaf coming off of there, another one there, another one up here. And also note that that bud at the base of each leaf, in this case, is grown into a flower. So instead of a branch coming out, that's another thing that could happen. This next one is also alternate. A little bit tougher to tell, although this one's an important one. This one is poison ivy. We can see that these are actually compound leaves. So here's the main petiole going all the way down to here. And then we have 1, 2, 3 leaflets. Remember that phrase, leaves of 3, let it be. And then we have another leaf coming in here, another one that kind of goes toward the back, another one over here. So those are alternating arrangement, but a pretty tough one. Then the last one should be pretty easy for you. That one is opposite. So on to some of the real details about the leaf blades themselves. Now, if you have a compound leaf, then you would often apply this to the individual leaflets as well. I'm definitely not going to go through all of these terms, and these are usually pretty technical terms. We can think of maybe more common terms for many of them. I want to concentrate mostly on blade shape, although what happens at the tip or the apex is also important. So I've described some of those tips up there, and the base of the leaf is important to look at. I've described some terms for looking at the base of the leaf down there. But again, let's just concentrate on the blade shape for now. Let me make a dividing line again here and say that the ones to the left usually apply to coniferous plants. And so these scale-like leaves, we're going to see on things like junipers and cypress and cedar trees. All like leaves we'll see there as well, especially on younger growth. And then needles are things we usually see on members of the pine family. Everything off to the other side, we're going to see more on the flowering plants, and they can be really narrow, so linear makes sense for a really narrow leaf. Others, lanceolate. That's kind of a strange term, but if you think of a lance, like a spear, this could be the tip of a spear, and so we could call it lanceolate or lance-like. Now, notice how this one is widest below the middle, but if we reverse that and the base of the leaf is still here, but the widest part is above the middle, but it has the same basic shape, we can call that oblanceolate, or in more common terms, reverse lance-shaped. Others like ovate, really ovate just means egg, refers to egg-shaped, and you can see that that does look very egg-shaped. Cordate refers to a heart shape. That makes sense there. Elliptical, sure, it looks like an elliptical shape or a football shape. You know, the terms are maybe not as important at this point as just recognizing that there are different shapes. You can make a leaf tracing. If you pick a leaf and put it under the paper, you can take pictures of these. You can make notes about them. You may have to look up the terms in the glossary of whatever field guide you're using, but all these shapes are those subtle differences, just like people's eye shapes make a difference. The flare of their nose helps you recognize them. These are the subtle differences that help us tell leaves apart and therefore the plants apart. Another one that does become pretty important as well is the margin of the leaf, that edge of it. Is it smooth along the edge like this first one here? Or is it serrated like a serrated knife or even toothed like a saw? These other ones are kind of strange. Crenate, just they're bumpy but not sharp. Or they could be heavily lobed, or they could have spines on them, like dentate. Sometimes if they end in this sharp spine, we might call them spinos. So there's a really big variety of things that go on at the edge of the leaf. And one other thing that's important that I am not going to get into is the hairs on the leaf. And usually the top of the leaf and the bottom of the leaf have different levels of hairiness. That's an important feature too, but a little beyond where I think we are at this point. I just wanted to point that out, that the technical term for this is pubescence. Very often books will talk about how hairy things are, if they're woolly versus bare. Those are important features as well. Well, let's practice a little bit. So pause the video and see if you can come up with a leaf shape or the blade shape for each of these. All right, let's look at these. So this is a classic elliptical shape, that football shape, but I also like to point out, look at these veins. They're in these arcing patterns. That's kind of unusual too, a subtle feature that would be good to note. These cattails have linear leaves. Of course, the Douglas fir on the top right there, those are classic needles. Scales we find on members of the cypress family, like this yellow cedar here. And then finally, on this buckwheat, we see cordate-shaped leaves. How'd you do? There's a lot of terms to get down, so I wouldn't be surprised if you struggle with them, but hopefully you're appreciating some of those differences. Let's practice again, not with the leaf shape, but with the margin of the leaf. Even if you don't have those technical terms down, see if you can describe what each of the margins looks like. All right, let's take a look. So this first one is dentate. You see how big and toothy those are. Looks like a bunch of big pointy teeth. This next one is crenate, and that means there's little bumps along the edge. It's pretty subtle, but if you look at this edge, you can see these little bumps. It's not just smooth. The next one is serrate. And lastly, this one you might call dentate, but they have these little prickly tips to each of the teeth, and so we might call that spinos as well. Well, that does it for this particular episode. I want to thank you for listening. I hope that helped kind of reveal the beauty of plants and the subtlety of the differences between them. I hope that helps you get to know them a little bit better. I mentioned some information sources at the beginning, and here's those references in case they interested you.